Part 6. Chapter 6. Unlike the shy twin from Chapter 5, not all souls who lack a physical body are reticent about making their presence known to those who do have one. Indeed, the so-called dead often take the initiative and reach out to the so-called living first, as do the not yet born. We put that modifier in front of the words dead and living because they start to have very different meanings once we experience the afterlife healing circle. It dawns on us that what seems like a stark divide between physical life and a vast unknown, the other side, may not be such an unbridgeable, unfathomable chasm after all. As Brianna pointed out in Chapter 2, people from pre-industrial societies were much more aware on this subject than we moderns, with all of our emphasis on logic, reason, and technology. They knew their ancestors were still with them in a very real sense because, unlike us, they did not cut themselves off from that wider awareness and community that the afterlife healing circle is designed to recapture and put to good use. Even today, indigenous peoples tend to be closer to the other side and more open about it than people in industrialized nations. One truth that astonishes those who are separated from spirit is that the dead and the not yet born have things they want to tell us, and they do not always wait for us to wise up and notice them. They find what seem like strange ways to get their messages across precisely because we are not paying attention and because we inaccurately think we lack the ability to communicate with the other side. One day a woman we'll call Barbara Strong answered the telephone. Her friend, John, was on the other end with something to tell her. It seemed fairly mundane except for one slight wrinkle. John had been dead for 8 years. Leukemia claimed his life back in 1967, just 2 days after Barbara's second child was born. I was shocked, the Texas resident and retired technical documentation writer said. He told me something important. Naturally, I thought I would remember that to my grave. I don't. One day when the phone rang for Barbara's sister, Kate Strong, also a pseudonym, the machine showed that the call was from the assisted living facility where their mother lived. It happened not long after Barbara's and Kate's father had passed on. Kate answered, but no one was on the other end of the line. She tried phoning her mother and got no response. Next she dialed the number displayed by caller ID and was told that no one from the residence had tried to phone her. The staff offered to check up on her mother, but Kate decided to do so herself. She found her mother in her bedroom with an arm wedged between the bed and the wall so tightly it was bleeding from her efforts to free herself. In my mind, it was definitely Daddy calling to let me know Mother needed help, Kate said. Kate's deceased father has reached out to her in other ways, too. Right after his funeral in Austin, Kate and her husband, Jack, were driving home. Looking at the clouds out of the car window, Kate asked silently, Daddy, if you're okay, send me a sign in the clouds. Instantly realizing she wouldn't be able to make out anything she wanted to see, she altered her request. Daddy, send a sign to Jack instead. She casually suggested that her husband scan the sky at the next red light. See what you can make out. At the next signal, Jack did as she asked. Wow, he exclaimed. I see a great big boat. That was Daddy's thing, Kate said of the cloud's shape. I knew he was all right and didn't have to worry anymore. The dead calling. This experience is by no means unique to Kate and Barbara. One Friday, the daughter of California resident Mary Rhodes relayed the phone message. It concerned a dear friend who was suffering from a lengthy terminal illness. Marshall is going to die on Saturday, the communication stated. He wants you to go with his wife to his daughter's college graduation ceremony. The next day, Saturday, the phone rang twice. The first 2 times there was silence on the other end. The third time I was called, Mary said, it was to tell me that he had died and I would need to tell his wife. He did not want us to return but to continue on to the graduation. Mary, many of whose family and friends have died, finds that the so-called dead are just as unpredictable as the living. Those I do think I will hear from I do not, she said. I am often surprised by those I do hear from. No one was more surprised by a visit from the departed than Richard Smith, a pseudonym for a Florida-based counselor. Around 1980, he was sitting in his living room a few days after the death of a man who had come to him for several counseling sessions, at the request of the man's daughter, who was Richard's friend. It was the day of the man's funeral. Suddenly Richard noticed the odor of freshly dug earth. Then he perceived the dead man's presence in his home. The man was distressed because he had not been able to tell his daughter something before he passed on. He wanted Richard to transmit his words to her. Although reluctant and feeling awkward, Richard agreed to the request. The presence and the smell instantly vanished. A few days later, Richard relayed to the daughter what her father had asked of him. She started to cry. Richard learned that she had not been able to reach her father's bedside in time. What Richard just told her now was the very same message that her family said the man had given them before he died. I don't remember the exact message anymore, but I'll always remember the experience, Richard added. The first communication Astrid, the inspirational speaker we met in Chapter 1, received from her dead father occurred when she was in the shower. This is where she prays and talks to God every morning. I heard someone tell a joke, she said. It was so sudden, so out of the blue, and so unrelated to what I was thinking, it took me a moment to acknowledge the probability that it could be my dad. Another memorable message from the departed happened periodically over a number of years to one of Jana's counseling clients we'll call Rebecca Winston. Living alone, Rebecca kept finding blood on the bed sheets. At first she naturally thought it was her own. Yet when these stains appeared, she would examine herself and find nothing that could account for the blood. Finally, she had a sample tested at a laboratory. It proved to be one of the rarest of blood groups. Even more baffling and unnerving, it was not Rebecca's blood type. We'll talk more about Rebecca's story later. The not yet born also resort to dramatic ways to reach out to their would-be parents. Connecticut resident Marianne O'Hare happily hit the sack one night at 8:01 p.m. Her job at the time as an early morning radio show host meant she had to rise at 3 a.m. on work days. Tonight she was looking forward to getting more sleep than usual. Suddenly, a shimmering beam of light appeared before the foot of the bed. It was like nothing I ever encountered before, she said. I panicked but was unable to move any part of my body. The light filled the room, and out of that light appeared a girl about 8 years old, a glowing light being fully formed. Her arms were outstretched toward me in a kind of appeal, Marianne continued. Telepathically she asked me if I would accept her. I was terrified at what was happening and still couldn't move my body. I was able to telepathically communicate back to her, I don't know who you are. You could be the devil disguising yourself as a beautiful child. Look at me, she replied. Look at my face. Marianne believed she had no choice except to do as asked. In that moment, I felt the weight of such a love as I have never known. It was unbelievably beautiful and ethereal and the kind of love folks report in near-death experiences. Now will you accept me? I will accept you. The shimmering figure floated toward Marianne, through her, merging into her being through the left arm. The room went dark and Marianne gasped, finally able to move again. Trembling, she looked at the clock. The time read 8:01. The laws of physics, time, and space had just been shaken to their core in my world. Marianne phoned a sympathetic friend and recounted what had just transpired. That was your daughter asking permission to be born, the friend replied instantly. Marianne was not so certain. She did not believe she would be able to become pregnant. The days and weeks passed and the encounter receded into her memory. The next spring, several months later, Marianne noticed her periods were irregular and went to the doctor. She was pregnant, and there was a heartbeat to prove it. Right up until giving birth on Halloween 1989, Marianne kept thinking she would have a boy. I remember being surprised to hear, it's a girl. The next instant I remembered the girl child emanating from a beam of light right in front of me. When she opened her eyes and looked at me for the first time, I realized this baby was that child. The ethereal child is now a young woman who looks very much like the little girl who came to her mother asking to be born. Not all pre-birth bulletins are so intense or so brief, according to our earthly time reference. Some take longer before coming to fruition. Rainey Joan was 39 and had 2 children. She and her husband had decided their family was complete. One summer, the family was on vacation at the beach in the Hamptons. Rainey's husband was windsurfing, and her 2 boys were playing in the sand. Rainey was sitting under a clear blue sky with one puffy cloud overhead. She looked up at it and heard a voice. I want to be born to you, Mommy, the voice said. Her husband did not believe her, but for 2 years, the author kept hearing the voice, which she knew belonged to a little boy. Throughout those 2 years she pleaded with her husband for a 3rd child. Finally, in exasperation, Rainey silently told the voice, go tell your dad. Although her husband did not hear a voice, he suddenly agreed to have another child. Less than a year later, Rainey, at 43, gave birth to her youngest child, a son now in his 20s. Deborah Frueh, an Illinois-based intuitive coach, told us a similar story. Many months before her fourth and last child was born, she remembers, I was well aware that he was sitting on my shoulder very insistently. Trying to start a catering company that offered healthy menus, Deborah had mixed feelings about the signal that another child was on the way. I didn't really think the timing was good for a new baby on top of a new business that I hoped would be all-consuming. Deborah went on, I kept telling myself it was a manifestation of the new business I was giving birth to, but deep down I knew it was another child, and he was born about a year later. Deborah believes her son signaled his impending birth to try to spare her the effort of launching a new business that ultimately went nowhere. For about a year or so, when people saw my newborn child, they would reflexively call him Little Buddha, she said. To this day he is my seeker child, always calling me to discuss philosophy and new thought. In addition to alerting parents to their pending arrivals, children often want their parents to know what to name them. To the son of Sharon Wyeth, a community college math professor in Texas and the author of a book about names, his name was really important. Unaware she was carrying a child, one night years ago Sharon dreamed that her first child came to her and told her his name, which she understood to be Joshua Jedediah. When she woke up the next morning, Sharon found out that her husband had had the same dream. He got a different name, but deferred to her interpretation. A few weeks later, they learned she was pregnant and began referring to the child, whom they knew would be a boy even before the sonogram, as Joshua Jedediah. 2 weeks before the birth, her husband had another dream in which the soon-to-arrive boy admonished him, "Why are you listening to her? She didn't get it right. I don't want my middle name to Jedediah. I want it to be Jeremiah." After her husband reported his second dream, Sharon agreed to call the boy Joshua Jeremiah. A couple of years later, it was late at night and her husband was away. Sharon was working on an art project when her toddler son, waking from sleep, walked in quietly and startled her. Out of the blue he said, "I came to you and gave you my name, but you didn't get my name right, so I had to go to Dad and give him my name. And then I had to go to Dad again because he thought you had gotten it right and he had not." Sharon's eyes grew wide. Neither parent had ever mentioned their pre-birth dreams to their little boy, thinking he was too young to understand. "Well, you ended up with your right name, so we're good," she managed to reply. Joshua Jeremiah was not finished with his grilling, however. "When are you going to let the other two come through?" he asked. "What are you talking about? You let me come through and you let my sister come through. When are you going to let the other two come through?" I looked at him and said, "Honey, I'm choosing not to have more children. I'm a school teacher. I deal with kids all day long. When I come home, I have just enough time and energy for you and your sister. I don't think I could do as good a job with 4. I think I'm done." "Oh," he replied, and walked away. Joshua Jeremiah had no way to know that years before, his mother, very much wanting 4 children, had carefully crafted 4 Christmas stockings for her offspring and put them away for the future. Pre-birth name instructions can come even from adopted children. Roughly a month after Austin, Texas residents John and Kathy Wilczek turned in their final adoption paperwork, Kathy had a vivid dream in which she heard, loud and clear, "Olivia is coming." The next morning Kathy sat outside as poetry poured out of her mind and heart and onto many pages. She was not a poet. 8 months later, Kathy's narrative book was presented to a young woman and her boyfriend, who chose them to be the parents of a little girl born a bit sooner than expected. When the adoption counselor called and asked what John and Kathy wanted to name their new daughter, they replied in unison, "Olivia." During the infant's christening, the minister read Kathy's poetry. "The children that are meant to come to us find a way," Kathy told us. "We have been talking a lot so far about communicating with discarnate beings and about perception that clearly does not involve only our 5 physical senses. Shortly we will review how it is all possible, and how and why the soul is an eternal continuum that we may call soulmate." This is a part of Zindagi Ki Roshni consultancy. It has been established for those who have lost someone and for those who are very sad in their life. About 100 PDF books and 20 short audio books of this topic will be sent to those who join it. This data will be sent to their email or WhatsApp. If you want to join this organization, then please send WhatsApp message to this number.